Tonight's story is called The Waiting Room. It takes place in the quiet corridors of a hospital after midnight, where only the porters, the nurses, and the sleepless patients remain awake. But not every waiting room is written down on the maps. Some don't appear in the records at all, and when people step inside, they are never seen leaving. In this story, we'll follow Neil, a night shift porter who begins to notice strange disappearances, an empty chair where a patient was sitting moments ago, a wristband with his own name on it, and finally a door that should not exist. This is a slow and unsettling tale, told gently to carry you towards sleep, if you can sleep. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The hospital at night was a different world. During the day, its corridors rang with chatter, telephones, clattering meal trolleys, and the endless shuffle of visitors. But when the evening fell and the lights dimmed to their humming sodium glow, the place seemed to shrink in on itself. Voices softened, machines whirred. The smell of antiseptic grew sharper, more noticeable, as though the lack of human noise made every other sense push forward. This was the time Neil liked best. He had been a porter at St. Mary's for nearly 9 years. His shift started at 10 o'clock sharp, ending at 6 in the morning, and in all that time he had come to know the hospital's moods, like one comes to know a person. By midnight, the outpatient wing was a hollowed shell, its chairs lined up and waiting for patients who would never come until morning. The wards became cocooned places, glowing softly under strip lights. The waiting rooms, those strange little holding pens scattered across the hospital, were where he spent much of his time. Neil's job was simple. He moved patients between wards, carried notes and supplies, and sometimes just acted as a reassuring presence. A porter was half invisible, but always there. Tonight was no different, or so it seemed. At 11, he pushed a wheelchair through the cardiac wing, the wheels squeaking in protest. His patient was an old man, wrapped in 2 blankets, though the air was warm. The man didn't speak, didn't even glance at Neil when he mumbled reassurance. That was fine. Silence, Neil thought, suited the hospital best at this hour. After dropping him off, he lingered by the waiting area outside cardiology. 3 chairs were set in a row beneath a television that hadn't worked in years. A vending machine hummed in the corner. He didn't remember seeing anyone there when he passed by earlier, but now a young woman sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up briefly, and Neil gave her a nod. "Long night?" he asked. She gave him the faintest smile, then looked away. Visitors waiting for relatives often wore the same expression, half-dazed, as if they had been caught between sleep and panic. Neil had seen thousands of faces like that. He left her to her thoughts and returned to his rounds. By midnight, when he passed again, the chair was empty. Nothing unusual in that, he told himself. Maybe her relative had been discharged. Maybe she'd gone outside for a smoke. Except when he glanced at the reception desk, the logbook was blank. No visitor had signed out. At 1, Neil made tea in the porter's room. The kettle was scaled, the mug stained brown. He sat with Graham, one of the older porters, who was filling in a crossword. "Quiet tonight," Graham muttered without looking up. "Yeah," Neil said, "though I saw a woman waiting outside cardiology earlier. Gone now. Didn't see her leave." Graham gave him a look, a half-smile. "You're noticing ghosts again." Neil chuckled, though uneasily. It was a running joke among porters that the hospital was haunted. Everyone had their story, footsteps in an empty corridor, doors swinging shut. Neil had his own, though he rarely shared them. He remembered one particular night in the oncology wing, when he swore he'd heard sobbing coming from an empty room. He shook off the thought. After his tea, he wheeled a bed down to radiology. The waiting area there was small, 5 chairs bolted to the wall. A man sat in the farthest one, wearing jeans and a checked shirt. His wristband gleamed under the fluorescent light, though Neil couldn't make out the writing. He assumed the man was waiting for a scan. When he came back half an hour later, the man was gone. Again, no name in the book. No nurse had called for him. The hospital's waiting rooms began to nag at Neil's thoughts. There were dozens scattered across the site, small spaces designed to be forgotten. Some had windows that looked out into the parking lot. Others were windowless cubes with peeling posters for flu jabs and blood donation. He began to notice patterns. A figure here sitting quietly, gone when he returned. A man with a bandaged hand in the surgical waiting area. A woman with red hair outside maternity. None of them ever seemed to pass through reception. None of them left footprints in the paperwork. By 3 a.m, his nerves began to tighten. He stopped outside the orthopedic waiting area and looked in. It was empty. The row of chairs gleamed faintly, the floor polished to a false shine. He told himself he would check again in half an hour, just to test his own mind. And when he did, there was someone there, a boy, maybe 12, in a hospital gown. His feet were bare, his face pale. He didn't look at Neil, only stared down at his hands as if counting his fingers. Neil froze. Something in the stillness of the boy unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Evening," he said softly. The boy didn't answer. Neil felt a pressure in his chest. He wanted to step forward to check on him, but instead he turned and walked away, quickening his pace. When he came back 10 minutes later, the chair was empty. At 4, the hospital had sunk into its deepest silence. The few nurses on duty moved like shadows. Neil wheeled another patient to imaging, then cut through a side corridor he rarely used. It ended at a waiting room he had almost forgotten existed, tucked beside the old chapel. The lights inside flickered. 2 chairs sat beneath a faded mural of a lamb and shepherd, and there, resting on one of the chairs, was a hospital wristband. Neil stepped inside. The air was colder here, with the damp stone smell of the chapel bleeding through the wall. He picked up the wristband. The plastic was still warm, as though it had only just slipped from someone's wrist. He turned it over. The name printed in bold letters was his own. Neil Carter. The floor seemed to fall away beneath him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the band in his hand, unable to breathe. His first thought was that someone was playing a cruel joke. His second was that perhaps he had finally gone mad from the endless night shifts. Then he heard footsteps in the corridor behind him. Slow. Deliberate. Coming closer. Neil pocketed the band, his pulse hammering, and stepped out into the hall. The corridor was empty. That was when the night stopped feeling like all the others. Neil Carter had always thought of hospitals as machines, vast, humming organisms with countless moving parts, each department a cog, every member of staff a gear. His job as a porter might have seemed small, but he'd long believed that if you pulled out even the tiniest cog, the machine would falter. That was why the night before had rattled him so deeply. Machines did not misplace people. They did not swallow them whole. By the time he clocked in the following night, the memory of the wristband in his pocket burned against him like a coal. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet. The small strip of plastic with his own name printed across it sat at the bottom of his locker, beneath a rolled-up jumper, hidden away as though it were something shameful. But the unease lingered. The shift began as always, a briefing in the porter's office, where tired staff gathered in fluorescent light, sipping vending machine coffee while the supervisor, Martin, rattled off assignments in his flat monotone. Transfers to wards, specimen runs to pathology, a body to the mortuary. Neil nodded along, taking his list, trying to mask how alert he suddenly felt when Martin mentioned a couple of outpatients being moved to waiting areas until transport arrives. Waiting areas, the phrase lodged in him. He told himself not to overthink. Patients came and went every hour. If some had slipped through the cracks of his awareness last night, there would be an explanation. Hospitals thrived on explanations, after all. Paperwork, records, notes scribbled in margins. He would find the trail. The records. The first chance he got, Neil ducked into the admissions office. The clerk on duty, a young woman with bitten nails and a cardigan draped around her shoulders, barely looked up from her screen. "Yeah?" she muttered. "Could you check something for me?" Neil asked, careful to sound casual. "Patients assigned to waiting room 2 last night. Just need to confirm discharge times." The clerk frowned. Her keyboard clattered. Minutes dragged. Finally, she shook her head. "No one logged to waiting room 2 yesterday. Just 1 and 3. Neil blinked. "You're sure?" She turned the screen toward him. Lists of names, timestamps, destinations. Waiting room 1. Several patients transferred out. Waiting room 3, 2 admitted, later discharged. But waiting room 2 remained blank, a white stretch of digital emptiness. Neil swallowed. "Must have been an error," he said, forcing a shrug. The clerk nodded vaguely, already returning to her work. To her, it was nothing. To Neil, it was the beginning of a crack in the walls. The CCTV later, on his way past security, Neil lingered by the desk. The guard, Tom, was a bulky man who survived his nights on donuts and crossword puzzles. Neil had known him for years. "Any chance I could take a quick look at last night's footage near the main corridor?" Neil asked. Tom raised an eyebrow. "You looking for something?" "Just thought I saw someone leave late, wanted to check." With a shrug, Tom pulled up the feed. Grainy black and white footage flickered onto the screen. Corridors washed in light, nurses passing by with clipboards, orderlies pushing beds. Neil leaned closer as Tom skimmed through the hours. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2. "Can you stop there?" Neil asked. At 2:14, the camera captured him walking past waiting room 2, trolley rattling before him. The door stood open, the room beyond faintly visible. Inside sat a figure, a man in a dressing gown, slumped forward, hands clasped. Neil remembered him. He'd passed twice, heard him cough once, but in the footage the man was alone. Then at 2:17 the camera caught Neil passing back the other way. The room was empty. No one had left. No one had entered. Tom squinted. "Could have been camera angle. You sure you're not tired, mate?" "Yeah," Neil muttered, stepping back. "Tired." He left before Tom could ask more questions. The notes that night, Neil began writing things down. He tore a page from a clipboard and folded it into his pocket notebook. Every transfer, every room number, every face he half recognized, he scribbled them all. A woman in a red coat sat in waiting room 1 at 11:30. He noted the time. A man with a limp went into room 3 at 12:05. Time logged. An old lady with a scarf waited outside X-ray at 12:45. Each entry was marked. He told himself he'd compare them against the admissions lists later, prove to himself that nothing was wrong. But even as he wrote, he felt the weight of the earlier discovery pressing down on him. The blankness of room 2 in the records, the silent disappearance on camera, and the wristband in his locker, waiting like a secret he couldn't let go. Anna. It was almost 3 a.m. when he finally spoke to someone. He found Anna, another porter, leaning against a vending machine, sipping a can of cola. She was one of the few he trusted, sharp-eyed, with a dry humour that cut through the monotony. "You ever notice the waiting rooms don't match the records?" he asked, voice low. Anna gave him a look. "That's a weird opener, Neil." "I mean it. Room 2. Patients go in, but they don't come out. And there's no log." She frowned, studying him. "You're serious?" Neil nodded. "I checked CCTV. It's like they vanish." For a long moment, Anna said nothing. Then she crushed her empty can and tossed it in the bin. "If you think something's wrong, put it in writing. Do an incident report. Make it official. Otherwise, no one's going to listen." "Yeah," Neil said softly. "Maybe." But he could see in her eyes that she half believed him. The incident report. At 4 a.m. he sat in the porter's office, pen in hand, paper before him. His handwriting looked awkward, forced. Patient observed in waiting room 2, male, gown. Seafood room empty. CCTV confirms no exit. He hesitated. Writing it down felt dangerous, as though committing the words would make them real. But Anna was right. Without a report, it would all fade into nothing. He added more. Admissions log shows no patients in room 2 on this date. Possible system error? Request further investigation. When he finished, he folded the sheet and slid it into the tray for review. It looked so small, so inadequate. But it was something. The clues. On his way back toward the wards, Neil noticed a clock on the wall outside pathology. Its second hand ticked with steady rhythm. But the minute hand was missing, snapped clean away, leaving only a jagged spindle. Strange. Later, near the staff lockers, he found a tortoiseshell button lying on the floor. He picked it up, pocketed it. Not because it mattered, but because he wanted to mark it. Evidence of something. By dawn, his notebook held a scatter of oddities. Missing minute hand, tortoiseshell button, wristband with his own name. Little tokens of unease. The printout. At shift's end, Neil trudged back to the porter's office, exhausted. The day staff were already arriving, chatter filling the corridors. He longed for silence, for the release of sleep. But when he opened his locker, a piece of paper lay folded on the shelf. He unfolded it slowly. It was a transfer slip, the kind used for moving patients from one area to another. At the top, bold letters spelled out, "Transfer to waiting room 3B." His eyes dropped to the patient information. Name, Neil Carter. He stared. His hands shook. He looked again, hoping he'd misread. But the words remained, black and unyielding. Waiting room 3B. He had worked in this hospital for over a decade. He knew every corridor, every annex, every broom cupboard. There was no waiting room 3B. And yet here it was, printed with the hospital's header, stamped with the date, official as any other slip. Behind him, the corridor hummed with the start of day. Voices rose, doors slammed, trolleys rattled. But Neil stood frozen, staring at his own name on the page, feeling as though the walls of the hospital were drawing closer, folding him inward. Somewhere, in a place he had never seen, a room was waiting for him. A room that should not exist. And the machine of the hospital, with all its cogs and gears, seemed to turn in silence around him, as though waiting for him to take his place. Neil didn't go home after his shift. He told himself he was too wired to sleep, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't leave, not with that slip of paper burning a hole in his jacket pocket. Transfer to waiting room 3B. Name, Neil Carter. He sat in the empty canteen, dawn light smearing pale across the windows, the hospital stirring with day staff. His untouched tea cooled beside him. He unfolded the slip again, as though it might have changed overnight. But the words were the same, stamped in official font, barcode printed neatly in the corner. It didn't look like a prank. It looked like hospital paperwork always looked, tedious, unremarkable, ordinary. And that made it terrifying. By mid-morning, Neil's curiosity outweighed his caution. He found himself in admissions again, speaking to a different clerk. "Could you check something for me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Transfer to waiting room 3B. Just curious which ward it's linked to." The clerk frowned at her screen, clicked a few times. "There's no 3B. "You're sure?" "Positive. Waiting rooms 1 through 3, that's it. No letters. Why?" "No reason," Neil muttered, backing away. Next he tried estates, cornering an engineer in blue overalls as he hauled tools down the corridor. "Do you know if there's a room 3B anywhere? Like an annex off the main corridor?" The man chuckled. "If there was, I'd have fixed a leaky radiator in it by now." He clapped Neil on the shoulder, trundling off. Everywhere he asked, the answer was the same. There was no 3B. No annex, no door, no hidden corridor. And yet Neil had the slip in his pocket. That night, as the ward lights dimmed and the corridors thinned of staff, Neil began his search. He started with the obvious. Waiting room 3 itself. It sat across from radiology, a cramped space with 10 chairs, a vending machine that rarely worked, and posters curling from the walls. Patients occasionally spilled into the corridor when the room was too full. Neil had been through it 100 times. He scoured every inch, checked the walls for uneven lines, pressed against the plasterboard, tapped for hollow sounds. He even crouched down to peer beneath the radiator. Nothing. Still, the slip in his pocket seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "Waiting room 3B exists," it insisted. "You just haven't looked in the right place." At midnight, Anna found him pacing the corridor near radiology. "You look like hell," she said. "Thanks," Neil muttered. She studied him. "This about that thing you told me? Room 2? And now 3B. He showed her the slip. Her brow furrowed as she read. "Where'd you get this?" "My locker, just sitting there." "Neil," she lowered her voice, "if this is some wind-up, it's not funny. And if it isn't," she broke off, pressing the slip back into his hand, "you need to leave it alone." "I can't." "Yes, you can. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us. You put that in a report, let management chew it over. Don't make it your problem." But it was his problem. His name was on the slip. Unable to sleep again, Neil found himself in medical records the next day, flipping through outdated floor plans. Most staff ignored him. Porters had wide-ranging access, and curiosity wasn't a crime. The maps were yellowed, corners torn, some from decades past. He spread them across a table, tracing the shapes of wings, wards, annexes long since demolished or repurposed. And then he saw it. An old blueprint of the East Wing dated 1974. Near radiology, a small square labelled simply WR3B. His pulse quickened, but the newer maps omitted it. Instead, a blank wall was drawn where the small square once sat. The hospital had swallowed it. After that, things sharpened. Or maybe Neil's awareness sharpened, tuning itself to details others ignored. The tortoiseshell button he'd pocketed reappeared, this time lying in the corridor outside room 2. When he picked it up, he realized it wasn't the same button. It was smaller, its pattern darker. The clock outside pathology ticked differently now. The second hand paused every 3 beats, as though skipping. And in the staff lavatory, he found another wristband discarded near the sink. This one read Patient, Carter, N. Diobia 12/3/1976. His details. Again. He shoved it into his notebook alongside the first. The pages bulged with scraps now, notes, times, objects, a private archive of strangeness. Driven by a need for proof, Neil returned to Tom in security. "Humour me," Neil said. "Pull up last night, near radiology." Tom grumbled, but obliged. The screen showed Neil himself pacing the corridor, pausing by waiting room 3, pressing against the wall. "See?" Tom chuckled. "You've lost it, mate." But Neil leaned closer. Something was wrong. In the footage, when he pressed his hand against the plasterboard, the wall rippled, just for a moment, like water disturbed. He blinked, rubbed his eyes. "Rewind that." Tom did. The wall was solid. Again. "Nothing. Forget it," Neil muttered, retreating. But in his memory, he could still see the shimmer. 2 nights later, Neil found it. He was pushing an empty trolley down the corridor near radiology when he felt it. A sudden resistance in the air, as though he'd walked through a change in pressure. The hairs on his arms rose. He stopped before the wall he'd studied so often. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The plasterboard gleamed dull. But something had shifted. The outline was faint, almost imperceptible, but there, a seam in the wall, a vertical line no blueprint had acknowledged. A door. Neil's breath caught. He touched the seam. Cold. His fingers tingled as though he'd touched static. Behind him, the corridor was silent. Ahead of him, the door waited. And for the first time in years, Neil felt like the hospital machine had turned its gears toward him, singling him out. The slip in his pocket weighed heavy. Transfer to waiting room 3B. It wasn't just a mistake. It was an instruction. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he pressed his ear against the plasterboard. At first, nothing. Then, faint. A sound from within. 3 knocks. Slow. Hollow. Neil jerked back, heart racing. His trolley rattled against the wall. He staggered away, staring at the seam. The door waited. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that one day soon he would have no choice but to step through. Neil arrived for his next shift with a heaviness in his chest, the kind of pressure that builds before a storm. He told himself he'd keep his head down, just do his work, avoid the places where his mind kept drifting. But the slip of paper remained in his locker, folded so many times its edges were soft. The hidden door lingered in his thoughts with every step he took through the corridors. The night began quietly. A transfer to orthopedics. Blood samples to the lab. A late-night call from maternity. Routine jobs that usually blurred together. But now each corridor seemed alive, each corner too quiet, each fluorescent light too pale. He carried his trolley past radiology, careful not to look at the wall. Yet his eyes strayed anyway, searching for that faint seam. It wasn't there. The plasterboard looked smooth, solid, ordinary. He quickened his pace, heart hammering. For the first few hours he tried to bury himself in tasks. He chatted briefly with nurses, joked with Tom at security, even helped a junior doctor find her pager. All of it felt like play acting, as though the hospital itself was testing whether he could behave normally. But the more he forced himself into routine, the more he noticed the slippages. Near the stairwell, he saw a patient in a dressing gown shuffling ahead of him. The man turned the corner, and when Neil followed seconds later, the corridor was empty. The man hadn't had time to vanish. There were no side doors, no alcoves, just silence. Later, he passed waiting room 1. A woman sat alone, red coat draped across her knees, eyes fixed on the floor. He noted the time, 1:13, and marked her in his notebook. But when he came back half an hour later, the room was empty. The admissions log would later show no one admitted at that time. His notes became the only proof she'd ever existed. The clock outside pathology still ticked with its strange hesitation. Every 3 beats, the second hand caught, then lurched forward. Watching it made him nauseous, as though time itself were faltering inside these walls. He stopped writing in his notebook for a while. Instead, he began collecting things. Small objects that seemed to appear where they shouldn't. Another button, this one plain and black. A theatre mask strap lying coiled like a snake in the lift. A discharge slip torn in half. No patient name, only the destination printed clearly. Waiting room 3B. He stuffed them into his locker, layering them on top of the wristbands, his private hoard of evidence. By 2 a.m, fatigue pressed hard against him. He slumped in the porter's office, listening to the hum of vending machines. The incident report he'd filed had gone unanswered. Management either hadn't seen it or hadn't cared. Anna avoided the subject entirely, as though afraid speaking of it would invite something down on her. When the radio crackled with his next job, Neil rose reluctantly. A patient transfer. Nothing unusual. He took the trolley and pushed it toward the designated ward. His footsteps echoed, louder than normal, each squeak of the wheels magnified in the stillness. As he turned into the main corridor, he froze. The wall by radiology. The seam was back. It was clearer this time, sharper under the flickering fluorescent tube overhead. A vertical line, faint but undeniable, splitting the plasterboard into 2 uneven halves. His breath came short. He pushed the trolley against the wall, leaned closer. The air felt different here, thicker, as though the space pressed in around him. He touched the seam. It was cold again, buzzing faintly against his fingertips. He pulled back, looking up and down the corridor. No one was around. The silence stretched. He remembered the knock he'd heard before, 3 hollow raps from the other side. He strained his ears now, waiting. The hospital hummed around him, but no sound came from the wall. He stood there so long his legs ached. Then, when he finally began to turn away, he heard it. One knock, slow, deliberate. The sound went through him like a shiver. He pressed forward again, ear against the plasterboard. Another knock, louder this time. And then, faintly, something else. A voice. Not words, just the low murmur of someone speaking, muffled by the wall. He staggered back, heart pounding. His trolley rattled as he gripped it for balance. He wanted to run, to leave the corridor behind, but his feet stayed planted. He slid a hand into his pocket, feeling the folded slip. Transfer to, waiting room 3B. Name Neil Carter. The wall seemed to pulse, the seam brightening under the fluorescent buzz. He blinked, and for a second he swore he saw a handle there, a metal glint half-formed from plaster. He shut his eyes. When he opened them again, the wall was smooth. Footsteps echoed behind him. He whipped around, nerves taut, but it was only Anna, coming down the corridor with her usual quick stride. She froze when she saw him standing so close to the wall. "You're doing it again," she said quietly. "There's something here." "No, Neil, there isn't. You're making yourself sick." "Listen," he urged. "I heard knocking. Voices." Her face softened, but her eyes were fearful. "That's the hospital talking back to you. You spend too long staring at its corners. It stares at you. Don't let it." She touched his arm, guiding him away. He let her, but his head turned back to the wall, to the faint line that had already begun to fade. Later, in the break room, she sat across from him, sipping tea. "You've got to stop collecting things," she said. "The wristbands, the slips. You'll drive yourself mad." "I need proof. You need rest." But rest was impossible. That morning after clocking out, Neil couldn't bring himself to go home. Instead, he returned to medical records, searching through older maps. He spread them out on the table again, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. The 1974 blueprint still showed WR3B, a small square tucked beside radiology. The newer maps erased it. But now, on closer inspection, he noticed something else. In the margins of the old blueprint, written in faded pencil, were words almost too faint to read, not to be used. The phrase chilled him. Who had written it? Why? He copied it into his notebook, underlining it twice. The evidence piled higher, but the more he gathered, the less sense it made. Objects appeared where they shouldn't. Rooms existed and then didn't. Paperwork slipped into his locker without anyone seeing, and all of it seemed to point in the same direction, toward a place he wasn't meant to find. That night, when he returned to the hospital, he moved through the corridors with a strange sense of inevitability. Every job felt like an interruption. Every transfer, every specimen run was something to be endured until he could make his way back to the wall. He avoided Anna's gaze. He smiled when Tom made his usual jokes. But his mind was elsewhere, circling the seam in the plaster, the knocks, the muffled voice. Just before 3 a.m, when the wards were at their quietest, he slipped away. The corridor by radiology stretched before him, empty, washed in pale light. The seam was there, faint but waiting. His pulse thundered. He placed a hand against it, feeling the cold buzz through his skin. A knock answered him. 1, then 2, then 3. This time, the voice was clearer, still muffled, but he thought he heard his own name. Neil. He staggered back, breath ragged. His notebook slipped from his pocket, spilling scraps across the floor. The tortoiseshell buttons, the slips, the wristbands, they fanned out in messy proof of his obsession. He dropped to his knees, shoving them back together, hands shaking. When he looked up, the seam in the wall was gone. Smooth plaster, unbroken, as though it had never shifted. The corridor stretched silent and still. Neil gathered his scraps and clutched them to his chest. He was sure of one thing now. The hospital was not just a machine. It was a maze, and some part of it had turned toward him, waiting. And one day soon, the door would not vanish. One day soon, it would open. Neil arrived for his shift already exhausted, as though sleep had refused him on principle. The air outside had been heavy with drizzle, the kind that slicked the tarmac without ever really falling as rain. He had trudged into the hospital like a man walking uphill, and by the time he'd changed into his porter's tunic and clipped his ID badge to his chest, he felt as though he'd been awake for days. The corridors greeted him with their usual humming fluorescence, the rattle of wheels on vinyl, the thin coughs of patients in distant wards. To anyone else, the hospital was the same as it ever was. But Neil knew better. Something had shifted permanently, and now the building watched him the way a patient watches a monitor, waiting for the line to go flat. He began the night with routine work, specimens to the lab, a transfer to oncology, a broken drip stand to wheel down to maintenance. He moved slowly, forcing himself to note the ordinary details, the weight of the trolley, the squeak of his shoes, the way a nurse thanked him without looking up. If he could focus on the normal, maybe he could anchor himself against what waited. But the normal frayed at the edges. Twice he saw figures vanish into corners where no door existed. A stack of discharge slips in the porter's office carried destinations he had never heard of. Treatment Annex 4B, Observation Unit closed, and once, chillingly, Waiting Room 3B. He slipped that one into his pocket, folding it with trembling fingers. By midnight, he could no longer resist. He took the long route past radiology, pretending to himself it was coincidence. The corridor lay quiet, the light overhead flickering in its tired rhythm. And there it was, the seam, thin, pale, almost invisible, but present. He stopped, staring at it. The air near the wall felt cooler, as though it leaked from a place where the hospital's heating did not reach. His hand rose of its own accord and brushed the plaster. That faint vibration was there again, like electricity under skin. A knock answered. 3 beats, measured, deliberate. Neil's throat tightened. He leaned closer, ear brushing the wall. A murmur seeped through, a low susurrus of voices, indistinct but unmistakably human. He thought he heard his name. He staggered back, notebook falling from his pocket, scraps scattered across the floor, buttons, slips, wristbands. His private archive spilled out for anyone to see. He knelt quickly, gathering them, heart pounding. "Neil?" He jerked around. Anna stood at the far end of the corridor, her face tight with alarm. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "It's real," he whispered hoarsely. "The room exists. I can hear them." Her eyes flicked to the wall, then back to him. "You need to stop this. You're scaring yourself. Come listen, please, just for a second." But she shook her head, visibly shaken. "No, whatever's behind there, it's not for us." He wanted to argue, to pull her closer, but something in her tone stopped him. She believed, at least partly, and that terrified her. He stuffed the scraps into his pocket and walked away with her, but the pull of the wall was unbearable. The next hour dragged. He transported a patient to ICU, wheeled a stack of bedding down to laundry, carried bloods to hematology. Every corridor he entered felt thinner, stretched, as though the building were holding its breath. The hospital's rhythms, machines humming, their doors hissing open, footsteps echoing, blurred into a background throb, all leading him back to one place. At 2 a.m, he gave in. The radiology corridor was deserted. The seam glowed faintly, no longer subtle, but sharp as a knife-line etched into plaster. His hand trembled as he pressed against it. This time, the wall gave. A shudder ran through him as the plaster flexed under his palm, softening, yielding. A breath of air seeped through, cold and damp. The seam widened, becoming a line, then a gap, then a door. Hinges groaned. A sliver of darkness opened before him. Neil's breath hitched. He looked behind him once, half expecting Anna or security to appear. No one came. The hospital held its silence. He stepped through. The corridor beyond was narrow and unlit, smelling of dust and antiseptic. His shoes crunched on grit. The walls were bare concrete, scarred with old drill marks where equipment had once hung. Ahead, a faint green glow beckoned, the emergency light of a room long abandoned. He moved slowly, hand trailing the wall. The air felt different here, still, stagnant, heavy with the sense of having been sealed away. He passed an alcove where an ancient gurney leaned against the wall, its mattress mottled with stains, straps dangling. The corridor widened suddenly into a room. Waiting room 3B. He knew it instantly, though no sign declared it. The shape matched the blueprint, the size exact. Plastic chairs lined the walls, their upholstery cracked, foam bulging through tiers. A clock hung crooked, its face stopped at 3:17. Dust lay thick across every surface, disturbed only by a few scuff marks on the floor. And on the central chair sat a bag. Neil froze. It was a standard hospital belongings bag, transparent plastic with a zip top, the kind used when patients were admitted. Inside, neatly folded, lay a tunic, trousers, a pair of shoes. His shoes. His tunic. His ID badge clipped neatly to the breast. Across the white label, written in block letters, Carter N. The breath left him in a rush. He staggered forward, grabbed the bag, held it up to the weak green glow. It was his. Every crease, every stain, even the pen mark on the pocket where his burrow had once leaked. He dropped it, stumbling back until his knees hit a chair. Footsteps echoed faintly behind him. He spun around. The corridor beyond was empty. But the sound persisted, closer now, measured, deliberate. Neil. The voice was unmistakable. His own name, whispered with a kind of bureaucratic indifference, as though called from a waiting list. He backed toward the wall, breath ragged. The chairs creaked as though unseen bodies shifted. He thought he saw shapes in the gloom, figures slumped, heads bowed, wrists bearing the faint gleam of plastic bands. Patients who were not on any record. He tried to run, but his legs buckled. Pain shot through his chest, sharp and blinding. He collapsed against the chair, clutching himself, the belongings bag crunching beneath him. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw before blackness closed in was Anna's face in the doorway, pale with terror. He woke in a bed. The ceiling above him was hospital white, the light too bright. A monitor beeped steadily at his side. Tubes ran into his arms. He turned his head, groaning. Anna sat beside him, eyes rimmed red. "You scared the life out of us," she whispered. "What happened?" His voice was dry, rasping. "You collapsed. Cardiac episode, they said. Lucky they got to you in time." Neil swallowed, throat raw. "The room, did you see it?" Her gaze faltered. She looked down at her hands. "I saw a door where there shouldn't be. I saw you fall. After that, they pulled you out." He waited for her to deny it, to say nothing was there, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned closer. "You can't go looking again. Do you understand? Some parts of this place aren't meant for us." He wanted to argue, to demand proof, to tell her about the bag, but when he looked to the chair by the bed, the bag was already there. Transparent plastic, his tunic folded neatly inside, the label with his name written clear. He closed his eyes. The hospital had kept him, not erased, not vanished, kept. And as the monitor beeped steadily beside him, he realized the truth. One day, when his name appeared on another slip, when the waiting room called again, there would be no pulling him back. He would take his seat like the others, hands folded, belongings sealed, waiting quietly for a number that was never called, and no one outside would ever know. You've been listening to The Waiting Room, the story of Neil, a hospital porter who discovered that some waiting rooms never empty. They only keep their patients forever. Thank you for joining me on this slow, unsettling journey. If you're still awake, I invite you to take a deep breath, let your eyes grow heavy, and release the story into the quiet around you. And if sleep is already pulling you under, then rest easy. The waiting rooms of this hospital will keep watch tonight. Until next time, sleep well.